BBC is a self-consciously progressive organisation. It has embraced every progressive cause, and it embraces those things very tightly, and it will not be shifted off that agenda. It's just an extraordinary spectacle of an organisation in denial, trying to pretend that what a growing number of people have come to see is the reality is not true. And it is true. They are biased. They are completely contradictory. You know, the boss resigns, but nothing's gone wrong. I mean, pull the other one. It's ridiculous.
Hi, it's Fraser Myers here, Deputy Editor of Spiked and producer of The Brendan O'Neill Show. I am absolutely thrilled that our friends at Beckett's Gin are back to give you guys a very special deal for Christmas. As a Brendan O'Neill Show viewer or listener, you can get 20% off all of their spirits. Beckett's is a fantastic company. It prides itself on using the best quality local ingredients, and they produce some truly superb tasting gin with that. I really like Beckett's barrel-aged slow gin. It's rested in a bourbon oak cask for 3 years, leaving behind rich notes of caramel, vanilla and coffee. And with the sweet flavours of cherry, plum and almond, this is definitely going to be my go-to drink as the weather gets colder. Their whiskey is another favourite of the team's. It's matured in casks that are usually used for slow gin, so you get a beautiful black cherry and vanilla flavour with a smooth honey finish. And here's the best bit. Fans of this show can get a 20% discount on all of the products I've mentioned and more. Just head over to beckettsgin.co.uk/Brendan to claim your discount. That's beckettsgin.co.uk/Brendan to get 20% off.
Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Robin Aitken. Robin, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Brendan. Thank you very much.
It's great to have you on. I've wanted to have a conversation about the BBC for some time. I talked to friends about it in the pub. I moaned to friends about the BBC, but I wanted to have a proper chat about it. And who better to have a conversation about the BBC with than you? You used to be in the belly of the beast. You worked at the BBC for a long time. You subsequently become a critic of the BBC. You've written books about it, titled Can We Trust the BBC? You've written lots of articles about it. And of course, people will have seen you around over the past couple of weeks when the BBC has really hit the headlines for its bias and its dishonesty and other controversies. So there's a lot to talk about, but I guess we should kick off by just asking, for the benefit of listeners, if you could just say something about what you did at the BBC, what roles you played, and I guess what was it like working at the BBC when you were there?
Well, thank you for that introduction, Brendan. And yes, you're right. It seems that I'm fated to carry this cross throughout my life, which is talking about the BBC. I was a reporter for the BBC, and I did many different reporting jobs. I had a 25-year career there. I stayed as a reporter because being a reporter was what I always wanted to do. I never wanted to get sucked into management roles because I'm a journalist, and that's where the journalism happens. So I ended up on the Today programme, and I worked there under Rod Liddell was the editor under the Today programme, and actually that period of my time at the BBC was my happiest period because I found that I went into the BBC with a very open mind. I was proud actually to work for the BBC. I considered it to be, when I was a young man, I considered it to be the gold standard of journalism. I felt that it was honest and straightforward journalism, and that I wanted to be part of that. And then over the period of my employment, I gradually became disenchanted with the organization, because I saw that though it proclaimed itself to be fair, open-minded, impartial in all matters, it really wasn't. Things came to a head eventually when I had been there more than 20 years, and I thought, this is just not right, because so many of the stories I was covering or wanted to cover were coloured by a institutional view of the world, which meant that as I saw it, we weren't actually telling the truth. So there were stories which I could not do because editors did not want me to do them. There were stories when I was working, for instance, on I worked in television current affairs for a while, back in old Lime Grove days, for the Money program. So that's an economic program. I had been an economics correspondent and business correspondent for the BBC up in Scotland in a previous incarnation during the Thatcher years. So I knew a bit about economics. I went to the Money program, and I found their take on economics to be very slanted. They were collectivist in outlook. It was they believed in a sort of planned economy in many ways. It wasn't my view of how the country's economics should be run. So I felt actually that I felt constrained in my role as a BBC reporter. And eventually I thought, this is rubbish. I'm going to do what I can to draw this to the attention of the people in control. So what I did was, to cut a long story short, I mean, I started complaining internally. I created a dossier of instances where I felt there had been really blatant bias on certain very sensitive subjects. And eventually I put those to the governors of the BBC, who at that stage existed. We've got something different now, different iteration of governance at the BBC. But I put it to the governors, and they basically told me to go and take a cold shower. They weren't interested actually in tackling. I never got a proper response to the problems which I tried to draw to their attention. It was shortly after that that, surprise, surprise, the BBC came along and made me a very generous offer to get lost. Uh, and at that point, I felt I'd gone down as far down the road as I could. I'd never gone public, by the way. I had this old-fashioned idea that, when you're employed by someone, you're taking a salary from somebody, you don't then step outside that contract and start bad-mouthing them publicly while still employed. So then I left the BBC and I started writing books. You mentioned one. I wrote another one last republished in 2021, which is this one, which is called The Noble Liar. A much better book, I might say, than my first book, which was a slightly jeune take on the problem that we face.
That's very useful rundown, and it's good to know. I mean, firstly, I always am startled when I'm reminded that Rod Little was the editor of the Today program.
Yeah.
We've had Rod on the podcast a few times. He's a good guy, but it's hard even to conceive of that period. But I'm pleased you were there as well, and you and him were making waves and doing good work.
Yeah.
And it's also good to know that you were drawing up memos and communiques about the problems at the BBC before the Michael Prescott memo, which we'll come on to shortly. That's the internal memo that has caused such a fuss over the past few weeks. But before we get onto that, you talk about the institutional bias at the BBC, the political bias. I wonder, how did it manifest itself on a day-by-day basis? You say that there were certain stories you couldn't cover, or when the BBC was covering the economy, you recognize a slant, a very an ideological slant, I guess. Did it also manifest itself on a day-by-day basis? Was it unpleasant being at the BBC, given that you're a social conservative and most of them are not? Was it a difficult place to work for someone like you?
If I can use a vulgarism, it's great if you're a shit stirrer. Because every program in the BBC, every editorial program, like the Today program, any news program that you're on, has a daily meeting, and their ideas are kicked around. By the end of my career, I felt no hesitation at all. In fact, I took delight in taking a counter position to that which I knew would be the consensus position in these meetings, because I think that's a joy to me to discuss these things. The frustration was that when Rod, of course, if you remember, you mentioned Rod, you've had him on the show, I know. He is a good guy. I really like Rod, actually. I consider him to be a friend. That under him, the thing worked properly, these daily meetings would be great. You'd toss out an idea, which would be a countercultural idea. He would take it up if he liked it. He'd argue. I didn't always see eye to eye with him, far from it. But, then if you made a case for it, he'd say, go ahead. But I worked then subsequently for other editors, and I'd worked for editors before Rod, who weren't really having that at all. In fact, his successor in the job of the Today program was entirely different kind of man. He wasn't interested in having a debate. He was interested in getting the stories that he wanted done in the way that he wanted, with the particular approach that he wanted. And that actually cut me out of the picture very often, because the kind of stories I wanted to do often cut across his agenda. Now, was it uncomfortable? Not really. I mean, the thing about the BBC is that, it's staffed by people who are well-educated, middle-class types. They're very polite in the main. They're nice people to work with. They don't steal your bike and they don't steal your biscuits. They're decent people. But if you were interested, as I am interested and still interested, in the subjects, you say I'm a socially conservative person. I am. So, for instance, let me give you an example. When I was working for Rod, I put up an idea that I could go to the United States and do a proper set of stories about the abortion debate there, and not just confining it to, isn't it awful that, these ghastly right-wingers are trying to restrict abortion. That story, which constantly is the BBC's line about abortion. I said, no, I want to go and I want to look properly at this debate from all angles. For instance, there was an organization, still is probably, called Democrats for Life. And these are people in the Democratic Party who believe themselves to be Democrats, but, don't believe in abortion. Those are the sort of voices I wanted to get on air. And voices like the original Jane Roe, I beg your pardon, who was the original Roe v. Wade. Somebody who had been at the epicenter of that story right at the beginning, but who came to be someone who regretted her part in it, regretted the fact that she'd had an abortion, and regretted the fact that abortion had become so widely available because she'd come to see it as a bad thing. I was able to put her on air. Now, that was unusual because of the kind of person Rod was. But elsewhere in the BBC, you would find it very, very difficult to put a story like that on air, because the BBC has a fixed position on these things. And that is because the BBC is a self-consciously progressive organization. It has embraced every progressive cause, and it embraces those things very tightly, and it will not be shifted off that agenda.
That's a really interesting example there, because I was going to ask you, how would you describe the bias at the BBC? Is it political? Is it ideological? Is it social, moral? Or maybe it's a mix of all those things? I've heard you refer to the BBC as left-wing, but the bias rather as being left-wing, would you say it's a kind of soft left, wet left, that kind of bourgeois left? How would you define the bias that you encountered from editors, from colleagues? What kind of bias was it?
That is a tricky question, because left-wing doesn't quite capture it. For instance, I know, and I think that they have good reason to be angry, the Corbynistas, people who were Corbynite left, hated the BBC. They felt that the BBC had a bias against them, which indeed it did. The way that Corbyn was pursued and harried over the so-called anti-Semitism that he embraced, supposedly, I think was ideologically driven inside the BBC. So what is the bias that is that defines the BBC worldview? I think if you forget left and right, it's more like a progressive liberalism. So I think of it as a progressivist organization. It has embraced those things, those ideas which predominate on the liberal left of society. But there are plenty of people who are in the Tory party, for instance, left-wing Tories, who are happily embraced by that position. So all those Tories who thought that it was a great idea to have gay marriage, who thought it was a bad idea to leave the EU, those sorts of Tories, they're part of the deal. That's this term which has come into vogue, the uniparty. So it's that great blob in the center of British politics, which agrees about all the important things, be they Lib Dem, be they Labour, be they Tory. These are people who basically agree about most things, and they only disagree about the details. Now, I was always outside that consensus for various reasons. I'm a Catholic, actually. I'm a Catholic and a believer in that sense. So that also is a position which, if you take it seriously, I think is going to place you outside the progressivist liberal center of things. You're always going to find yourself in opposition to certain of those ideas which are held by those people.
When did this happen? Because older listeners will remember that the BBC, a time when the BBC wasn't like this. I mean, we know the history of the BBC. We know it used to be a pretty stuffy corporation, bit buttoned up. We think of the Reithian values, lifting up the masses through enlightened entertainment and culture. There was even a paternalistic strain originally in the BBC in terms of how it approached the public. And one might argue that that was a good thing or a bad thing. We can have that discussion. And people will remember that it was previously a pretty conservative organization, maybe a small c conservative organization. But so was there a big switch? Was it an overnight problem? And when do you think this problem that you're describing set in the BBC?
If you read the history of the BBC, the early history of the BBC, and there is the historian Asa Briggs who was the official BBC historian for many years and produced the first volumes. If you go back to those and you read those, what you'll find is that actually from its earliest days, there were suspicions on the right of the BBC because it was a socialist, it was a collectivist, socialized project, and but in those days, we're talking the 1920s and the 1930s, there were speeches in the House of Commons, for instance, which criticized the BBC for this perceived bias. But you're quite right to say that the BBC emerged from World War II, both with its status enhanced because of the noble role that it had played in many ways during World War II. I find it moving, for instance, to read those accounts of people in the French resistance who, tuning in with their little crystal radio sets, their shortwave radio sets, and getting news which they trusted, which was from the BBC, because they were surrounded by media which was basically Nazi propagandist. So, the BBC had its golden period during those years. It emerged from the war years with very high. It was held in very, very high esteem, and it still was in those days a socially conservative organization. So what then happened? Well, what happened in the BBC, I think, was what happened in the rest of society, and I have come to see this as a generational change. So I think that my parents, who were born in the early years of the century, in 1915, 1914, they came to adulthood just as the Second World War started. Theirs were lives which were marked by this collective sense of threat, an existential threat, which I think imposed discipline on them. And they were socially conservative people. And I think that generation had their hands on the levers of power right through into the 1960s. But by the 1960s, there was an upcoming generation, the boomers, um, who, in a very natural way, because this happens with every generation, reacted against their parents' values and standards. And so those thrusting young people came into the BBC, as they came into every other profession, and they carried with them a set of values which were a rejection in many ways of what their parents had believed. And so you got this generational change. By the time I came into the BBC, which was the late 1970s, it was, by that stage, the BBC had one thing which had happened, which was that the BBC went out to seek controversy. Up to that point in its news and current affairs output, certainly in the 60s and in the 50s and before, had deliberately avoided controversy. They reported controversy, but they didn't seek to stimulate controversy. But the young men and women who took over positions of power in BBC News and Current Affairs in the 60s, that wasn't at all what they wanted to do. They came in often with, often they were very political, some of these people. I remember a very influential man who I knew a bit called Vincent Hanna. He was a notable BBC journalist, worked on Newsnight and other programs. He was a real controversialist, a very left-wing guy. And the BBC embraced that. The BBC went out of its way to embrace that. So that's one part of the story. Another part of the story, often overlooked, by the way, is what happened in the 1990s when John Birt, now Lord Birt, who eventually became Director General, but was the Deputy Director General under a guy called Mike Checkland. Now, Checkland was an accountant. He wasn't a program maker and he wasn't a journalist. And so he appointed Birt as his number two, who was in charge of all BBC journalistic output. And Birt did this thing, which was that he abolished the departmental distinction between news and current affairs. And it might sound a very slight thing, but actually it made a difference. I had originally worked for local radio and then BBC Scotland, but I came to London in the main BBC newsroom, the radio newsroom. And we reporters in news had a very, I think, quite a rather arid, you might think, view of what our job was. So you'll be familiar with this, Bradley, So basic job of the journalist, to answer these questions: who, what, where, when, why, right? Now, why is the odd man out in those. In news, as a news reporter, I thought, who, what, where, when? Yep, that's my job. I'll tell you the facts. Why? Oh, well, that's a job of interpretation. Why did this happen? That's a bit current affairs-y, right? And that's what current affairs did. And it was quite separate from news. And actually, news were pretty sniffy in some ways about current affairs, as they were sniffy about us. And Bert came in, he said, no, this is no good. He wrote a very influential article, which appeared in the FT, which was about the mission to explain, which he co-authored with another great intellectual of the time, Peter Jay. And their view was that journalism had to go beyond who, what, where, when. It had to explain why. Now, when you do that, you put into the hands of the journalist the responsibility and the duty of interpreting events. Now, at that point, it's clear, isn't it, that there is scope for personal bias, if you like, or here, I like this, you might like this too, that the BBC doesn't talk about bias internally. It talks about revealed preference, right? And revealed preference, is what we're talking about in this context. A current affairs journalist might reveal his preferences, by the interpretation he puts when he answers the question why. It's a small point, but I think actually a significant point. And from that point on, which was about 1997, I would say, probably, 96 perhaps, somewhere around about that point, mid-90s. From that point onwards, I think things slipped in a bad way towards more interpretation. You had no better example of this than the fact that during that period, when Bert was in charge, Polly Toynbee was hired as the BBC's social affairs editor. Now, I've got nothing against Polly. She is what she is. She believes what she believes. She's never made a secret of it. And she didn't make a secret of it either when she was in charge of the BBC's news output on social affairs. That's an illustration of the problem you get if you allow your journalists to become interpreters and commentators. There's the problem.
I think that's very well put. And, I want to go on to what's happening now, what's happened over the past few weeks, and what that tells us. But first, I just want to ask you, I guess, how we got to that period, as you describe, in the mid-1990s, when it sounds like there was a pretty massive shift from the BBC explaining, the BBC telling us what's happening, to the BBC explaining to us why things are happening and basically how we should think about these things. Because when I don't know the history of the BBC in nearly as much detail as you do, but I often think about, I guess, two big shifts at the BBC. I think about the 1960s. That was the week that was, the arrival of all these kind of young, hip, still quite posh, but, young, hip, rebellious people. And I often think of that period, the shifts in the BBC being quite contained. I often imagine that even though that was the week that was quite explosive at the time, in my mind, I think of it as quite a contained phenomenon. It felt like it was still part of the BBC phenomenon, but maybe it had a longer term impact, those kinds of shows, that kind of thinking. But then I also think of the 1980s, and I've heard you talk about the Thatcher years. You've already mentioned the Thatcher years in relation to how the BBC understood the economy at the time. And that's when I think it became more problematic, because you've said that the BBC in some ways became the unofficial opposition in the country at that time. It defined itself in some ways against Thatcherism. And I think that's probably where it starts really to come unstuck in terms of journalism and its mission. How would you see the 80s in terms of that transformative moment for the BBC? How problematic was it that it took this stance against Thatcherism?
The thing about Thatcherism was that she assaulted and eventually vanquished a consensus which had existed since the late 50s about the economy. It was essentially about the economy. And so Keynesian economics, so-called, the idea that the state can, by judicious use of borrowing and state funding, prime the economy to grow. And you can do that and you needn't worry too much about how much you're borrowing, because in the end, you'll get more back than you put in. And Thatcher, of course, did not believe that. So on the economic front, a lot of the movers and shakers within the BBC by that time were young people, because actually journalism, is a young man's game in many ways. So because it's very, it's certainly, if you're running a program like Newsnight or Today, it's a really, that's a really demanding job, long hours, etc., etc., etc. And so, tend to be fairly young people who are in the job of editing those programs. And those young people carried with them this thing I was talking about a moment ago, the idea of the rejection of their parents' generation's values, and they were very hostile to Thatcherism. What has often been said about Thatcher, and I think it's true, is that her main focus really was on economics, and cultural issues were things which she worried less about. And there was less focus from her administrations on cultural issues. And so in those years, the BBC promoted and amplified a social message which was very socially liberal. And they got away with that. They were in conflict. The BBC was in very bad odour with Thatcher's government, but mainly on the economic issues. For instance, during the miners' strike, which I remember very well because I reported a lot on it up in Scotland, there was a lot of pushback from the government because they felt that the miners were getting a too sympathetic ride from the BBC, which I think they probably were in many ways. But that was because, there's another facet. I mean, this is going off topic a little bit, but certainly television is a medium which can very well convey human problems. Abstractions it's not so good at, So if you're dealing with, the miners' strike, okay, how tough that was for mining communities, how tough it was for the wives, how awful it was for scabs, all the rest of it. That side of the story you could do, and you could very easily illustrate it. If you're trying to illustrate something like the balance of payments deficit, that's an economic abstraction, which to the audience will have, to a lot of the audience, I don't mean to the intellectual audience, people who immerse themselves in current affairs like you and me, right? We are obsessive about this stuff, and we understand it, or we think we do. In my case, probably not. But for a lot of the audience, sitting there in front of the 9 o'clock news, as it then was, the emotional story of the people involved is going to have far, far more impact than the abstract economic argument about the need of the country to cut its costs and how we could not support industries which were soaking up money and making us less and less competitive. That's a more difficult argument to use on television. So that's another side. I don't know if I've answered your question there, but I think that was one of the things which was happening during the 80s, that there was this pushback against Thatcherist economics, and there was at the same time an embrace by the BBC of what I would a firmer embrace of liberal social policies.
That's really interesting. In my contrarian mind, I'm now imagining that David Frost was the countercultural figure in 1963 and Margaret Thatcher was the countercultural figure in 1983, kind of smashing up the old post-war consensus. And the BBC's shifting role in relation to those phenomena is quite interesting. So let's come forward to where we are now,
Sure.
because I think you've been talking about this problem for a long time. You've experienced it yourself. You've told your story about the BBC. I think many more people are now opening their eyes to this problem. And of course, we had the Michael Prescott memo. We've had, three big issues that have come out of that. There's the Trump editing on Panorama.
Yeah.
There's the trans question, and there's also the Israel question. And on all of those issues, the BBC seems to have failed quite spectacularly to capture the reality and the truth of various things. What did you think when that came out? Presumably you weren't shocked by what was revealed, but did it make you think that things have got worse since your time, or did you think it was going in the logical direction that you had anticipated? What did you think when you read those revelations?
Well, I was quite shocked by some of the detail. For instance, the idea that you would take a speech by the President of the United States and edit it in such a way that it did a violence to the meaning he was trying to convey when he was actually speaking. That to me is, that's just a television lie. That's just a lie done in a television edit suite. And so I was quite shocked by that. And I was, on the trans issue, it begs the question, why on earth has the BBC got a stable of correspondents who are defined by their sexuality or their gender identity? Why on earth has the BBC ended up with that? I mean, they don't do it for, you would not have a group of correspondents who were defined by by their race, for instance. You wouldn't turn over the reporting of, let's say, Jewish affairs to Jewish reporters, would you? I mean, why would you do that? And why would you do it with trans? It's with LGBTQ plus correspondence. So that was shocking to read that, actually, that those people had such. Although, I had noted, as I'm sure many of us had, that the BBC's reporting of the trans issue was so thoroughly skewed for the previous decade that there had to be a reason for it. And actually, Prescott's memo displayed in all its gory detail what that detail was. The thing about the Arabic service of the BBC and the fact that it was seems to have been staffed mainly by people who were quite openly sympathetic to Hamas, that is such a cardinal sin. So all these things, what did I think about it? In one way, I thought, here we go again. This is another example of something no one could ever have imagined the BBC would have fallen into. I mean, remember that as long ago as 1997, we had the Martin Bashir interview with Lady Diana, with Princess Diana, I beg your pardon. And what then was revealed 20 years later, the extent of the cover-up and the double dealing which had gone on to get that interview, and the way that people like Diana's brother, he was gaslighted by the BBC for decades. So in that context, when you think of that, and I'm well versed in all these things because I make it my job to be. So what I saw in the Prescott memo was a further examples, I should say, of the same sort of journalistic sins as had been committed back as long ago as 1997. So what does that tell you? To me, it tells you that there is something actually rotten right at the core. And I the fact that the BBC's then response, the initial response to the Prescott memo, struck me as completely incoherent. First of all, they set this hair running about a right-wing conspiracy. Well, the only person, and a right-wing coup at the BBC, well, from their telling, the only person who was responsible for this was one right-winger, Robbie Gibb, who supposedly effected this coup entirely on his own. I mean, it's ridiculous. And then we had the bizarre spectacle of the BBC's Director General falling on his sword and the head of news, and these two people saying, well, we must go because these things have been done. But then the corporation repeatedly standing behind its journalism and saying there is no problem with impartiality at the BBC. How do those two things stack up? They are completely contradictory. The boss resigns, but nothing's gone wrong. I mean, pull the other one. It's ridiculous.
I had the exact same thought. It was so contradictory the way they responded, and it's such a rubbish response. They really did not seize the opportunity to have a moment of self-reflection. But on the Trump thing in particular, I want to ask you about some of these things a little bit individually. The Trump, I guess that kind of panorama edit, as you described it was essentially a lie. They essentially made something up in the editing suite, which is just not what journalists should do. I mean, the answer to this question might be obvious, but what do you think explains the BBC's hostility to Trump? I mean, I know there's Trump derangement syndrome. Everyone seems to be suffering from it. But the BBC seems to have a particularly bad case of it. I guess to put it another way, is there a world in which it's possible for the BBC to report on Trump in a neutral way? Because I've never seen that. I don't think anyone has seen that. Or is the BBC such a lost cause that when there comes along a brash, right-wing politician like Trump, who's voted into power by, the kind of so-called rednecks that the BBC would look down its nose on. Is there any universe in which the BBC can treat that neutrally, or is it just a busted flush now when it comes to people like Trump?
Well, I'm afraid that the answer to that question is that I cannot see, as presently constituted, how the BBC is ever going to give someone like Trump a fair crack of the whip. And, there are examples closer to home. Tommy Robinson, for instance, a slight diversion from the Trump story, but forgive me, but I've met Tommy a couple of times. Look, I don't sign up to the Tommy fan club completely, but I do think there's a man who has been singled out by the powers that be because he represents a threat to the political consensus. And there's this wonderful thing that the stunt that Tommy pulled on Panorama was, to me, a joy to behold. So if I can tell you this story, because it's worth telling. So Panorama had set up a program. They were in the process of making a program about Tommy Robinson. And the working title internally was Take Down Tommy, right? And they contacted many people who'd had contact with, who knew Tommy, and they were trying to get, bad press on him. And they contacted a young woman called Lucy Brown, who had been close to Tommy for a while. And they set her up to do an interview. But she contacted Tommy and said, Panorama are after you, what should we do? So Tommy mic'd up Lucy, and she went along for a boozy supper with the production team. And what came out of that was footage which was so embarrassing about the way they had tried to coach her to make sexual slurs about Tommy, which she didn't want to do because they weren't true. And when the reporter involved, John Sweeney, was he was caught on camera making blue jokes and off-color jokes about Irishmen and black men, and Tommy then this was the funny bit, and it's worth seeing because it is online if you're interested to look. Tommy then agreed to do an interview with Panorama. The production team came in, all smiles. Tommy had set it up in a hall. He'd put a screen in. He said, just before we start the interview, I'd like to show you something. And he showed them a secret recording of the production crew. Now, okay, that's a long-winded story. It's a great thing to see. It's called, and then he broadcast this on a screen outside the BBC's headquarters in Salford to some of his supporters. And you can find it's called Panodrama, it's called. But the point I want to make about that is this, that Tommy Robinson, for all his faults, and he has many, is that the point about Tommy Robinson is he was a working-class white bloke who, quite by happenstance, became a political leader of sorts, just because of the circumstances he found himself in. If the BBC if Panorama if Panorama was a straight organization, the interesting question would have been, why is this working-class white bloke, why has he got a following? What are the grievances of the people who sign up for Tommy and who are on Tommy's side? What is going wrong in those communities that make people follow Tommy? But were they interested in those serious questions? They were not. The only thing they wanted to do was to take down Tommy. And that shows you, that whole episode, to me, shows exactly what the problem is at the BBC. That there you have a guy, as I say, I don't hold a candle for Tommy, but I do think that communities like the one he came from in Luton, which had seen mass immigration from a completely foreign culture, completely take over the neighborhood where he grew up, you know, how much, can we not all understand what the grievance and the difficulties that causes? So there would have been a worthwhile panorama exploring what those grievances were. Instead, it was a hatchet job. There's the problem. Tommy and Trump, there are many differences, but you get my point. They come from the same neck of the political woods, and that's the point.
One gets the feeling that the BBC is increasingly less and less driven by curiosity and more by ideology, because a journalist would be curious as to how these things happen, how these political movements grow, what's motoring them, who supports them. I mean, those are the basic questions of a journalist. You're interested in finding out. Whereas it sounds like the BBC approaches things with the idea of how can we take this down? How can we expose it? How can we make fun of it? I had a similar feeling about the Football Lads Alliance a few years ago, which was this huge movement. And in fact, some of them said that Tommy Robinson wasn't welcome on their marches because they were uncomfortable with him. But it was this huge movement of football fans from the working classes who were marching about Islamist terrorism. After the Manchester Arena bombing, the London Bridge attack, there were huge demonstrations. And the lack of curiosity at the BBC and in other media institutions, I thought, was extraordinary. There were these instant denunciations of these people as just racist scumbags and no querying, why are you doing this? Who are you? Where do you come from? Just a failure of the journalistic ideal. But on the trans thing, I did want to ask you one more thing on the trans thing. I think your point about having an LGBTQ plus desk is very well put. Just such a bizarre phenomenon. Imagine going back and explaining that to Reith or, anyone from the past, really.
I know.
But there was a censorious element to that aspect as well. And I think one of the things that Prescott said, and it's come out in a lot of the media discussion, is that not only did they push this, in my view, insane notion that sex can be changed and men can become women. The BBC was at the forefront of promoting that kind of cultish belief. But they also were quite strict about not allowing on gender-critical feminists or people who had the alternative view, or certainly silencing them or treating them as weirdos. Those kind of reasonable voices were treated as the unreasonable voices. Were you shocked by that, or have you encountered a similar dynamic where the BBC doesn't only push a certain view, but seeks to silence other views?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that was the whole wickedness, the wrongness of what they were doing. And I think that this mass delusion, which has gripped so many people about the idea that somehow your sex and gender, you have this thing called gender, which you can decide for yourself on the basis of your emotion. I mean, where did that come from? Actually, I know where it came from. It came from a Californian feminist academic who floated the idea of gender theory back in the late 1970s. She was a very unhappy woman herself, a confused woman, and she floated this notion of gender about it being a social construct. And it's so typical of the sort of people we're talking about. These are pocket intellectuals who are fascinated by these transgressive theories which turn on their head all the things that the wisdom of the ages has taught us about humankind. But there's another, unless the fire's gone out of it now, but the way in which the BBC, for decades, they silenced any serious debate about Britain's place in the EU by simply not allowing Eurosceptics on air. A Brexit, a Eurosceptic peer, funded out of his own pocket a monitoring exercise of BBC output right from the late 1990s through actually until 2016 when the referendum happened. And that showed, so what they did was they tabulated BBC output on the main news programs, and they just counted up the amount of time which was given over to skeptics and Europhiles. And the imbalance was just grotesque. It was something like 90-10. Actually, it was more than that. It was about 93-7, you know, in favor of the Europhiles. And that was an illustration of the way in which just the same thing happened with the trans debate, that the BBC is the gatekeeper in many ways of the national debate. And it's less true now, actually, because of the fragmentation of media influence. So it's less true now. But certainly up until the turn of the century, the BBC was overwhelmingly the gatekeeper of the national debate. And if the BBC wasn't saying it, it wasn't happening. It wasn't happening as news. Now, they've lost a lot of that power, thankfully, because now there are other platforms like this one where people can find a different point of view if they so wish. Of course, it doesn't mean that the BBC is something then we can just ignore and say it doesn't matter any longer. It does. It still has enormous influence, and it is still paid for by all of us. And that's where the problem lies for the BBC.
Listening to you there talk about the lack of Eurosceptic voices on the BBC, which is so true, and people of a certain age will remember that in the 90s and into the 2000s, they just weren't there. You just wouldn't hear them. And even obviously during Brexit and after Brexit, the sense of palpable alarm at the BBC that the plebs had voted to leave the European Union. I mean, you could hear it in their voices all the time. I'll never forget Dimbleby's ashen face when he had to announce the result. You know, he couldn't believe that the people did this to them. But what's interesting listening to you say that is that you will know that there's a lot of right-wing people or socially conservative people like yourself who criticize the BBC. And there's a lot of left-wing people who criticize the BBC as well, and not just radical leftists like the Corbynites, but also liberals and Lib Dems and so on. And they will often say the BBC is pro-Brexit. The BBC is too right-wing. The BBC gives too much coverage to Nigel Farage. The BBC is too trans-skeptical. I've even heard people say that. Or the BBC is too pro-Israel. People, I just want to grab people by the scruff of the neck when they say that, because it's just so obviously stupid. But people do say that. And I'm sure you will have heard that. And the BBC often responds by saying, well, if both sides are slagging us off, we must be doing something right. How do you cut through that discussion?
Well, you're quite right. And the problem is that bias, like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder still.
Yeah.
So each side thinks it's not getting a fair crack at the whip. That's why the BBC finds it very easy, by and large, to dismiss critics like me or other critics. They say just what you've said. Well, we get criticised from both sides, you know. We're in the middle somewhere. And therefore, they're able just to slough off the criticism. That's why the Prescott dossier was important, because the Prescott dossier came from inside. You know, this was not an external critic. This was, heavens above, this was someone who was being paid by the BBC to be an advisor to the Standards Committee. He was there, and Prescott is, I don't know Michael Prescott, but I've checked out his reputation, and he's a serious journalist who I'm sure is an honest man. And he was working internally, and this is what he found. And the BBC still has the gall to dismiss him. They cannot say, oh, well, we get criticism from both sides. This is from inside. This isn't from outside. It's from inside the organization. And still they're in denial about it. That's the extraordinary thing. I mean, I say to the whenever that thing comes up about whether we get criticized from left and right, I say, yes, but look, I've remembered the name of the person I was struggling for. It's Lord Mackay of Clash Fern, who was a Eurosceptic peer, fine man, actually. And he made a lot of money. He was a rich man, so he paid for all this, media monitoring himself. And the methodology which his media monitors used was that which is promoted by the British Staphylogetical Society and all the authoritative bodies in that social sciences world recognized the methodology they were using, and still the BBC flatly rejected it. And, the point here is this, Brendan, and this is the crucial point, I think. So you might say, well, in the face of all this evidence, why does the BBC go on so stoutly defending its impartiality when that has become a risible thing in the eyes of many of us? And the reason I think is this, is because if they once admitted, if they said, look, well, actually, you're right, we do have a problem with impartiality, and you've demonstrated it, at that point, then you've got a reform project on your hand, which is massive, because how would you go about reforming the BBC with its deep-set culture, which is both coherent and cohesive and actually quite coercive? I often say the BBC has groomed Britain. Yes. Yeah. Thinking about Jimmy Savile, it's it's not the wrong word. They've groomed the country to come around to their point of view on so many of these issues. And the point is that if they once admit that their impartiality has been something of a unicorn, i.e. an entirely mythical beast, then they have to do something about it. So they resist, and they resist, and they resist, and they resist. And it's just an extraordinary spectacle of an organization in denial, trying to pretend that what a growing number of people have come to see is the reality is not true. And it is true. They are biased.
And there's such a tragic element to this, because earlier on you gave us the vision of members of the French resistance listening to the BBC on their radios in a sea of Nazi propaganda. Fast forward to the 2020s, and we have BBC Arabic employing journalists who say we should burn the Jews like Hitler did, or saying other obscenely anti-Semitic things. I mean, you can't get a bigger fall from grace than that. From serving that great role in the Second World War to employing these kinds of people to spread lies about Israel in the 21st century. Robin, I have just one more question for you. It's a big one, so you might not have time to answer it in depth, but I did want to ask you about, we've talked about the BBC and the future of the BBC and whether it can shake itself out of the problems that it faces. But I did want to ask you about the funding question, because that's another huge element of this, which doesn't often get as much airtime as the other issues. Is it right that we still have a license? Is it right that we are still compelled as TV owners to fund the BBC in the era of streaming, the era of subscription, the era of choice? As you say, the media is now incredibly fragmented and full of lots of choice and interesting things. What do you say on that front? How will the BBC survive if the license fee were to go? Should the license fee go? What do you think?
Well, it is, as you say, it's a drier subject than what we've been talking about, which is all the good stuff. But yes, the license, but it is at the heart and the very key to the BBC's future role. So a tax levied on all of us on behalf of the BBC can only be justified if the BBC is fair to all comers. So the contract, if you like, between the BBC has this massive privilege of the license fee, which brings in a fixed or a predictable income year on year, something which no other media organization in the country enjoys. That's a real privilege. So what is the quid pro quo for the privilege? The quid pro quo is that it is fair to all comers and that it gives everyone's voice. Everyone has a chance to make their voice heard. And the BBC has failed in that. So I would say that it has forfeited its right to the license fee. The only way that you could justify it now would be if the BBC undertook a massive reform programme. And look, one thing I want to say actually is that I think that the ideal of the BBC, the ideal in a democracy like ours, of an organization which without fear or favor reports fairly on national and international events, that is a priceless thing for a democracy. Because if you had a totally reliable, totally fair-minded source of information, I would gladly pay for that. But the trouble is that the BBC has lost, it has forfeited that right, in my view. And also, I think that because of the fragmentation of the market and because of the way, particularly young people, they don't look to linear TV. They don't look to BBC One, BBC Two. They're just not switching on. So you've got an aging core audience for your main television channels, and other people, the younger generation, which can get, which is now used to getting information from all over the place, largely free of charge. So they're saying, well, why am I having to pay this, 200 quid a year? It's not 200, it's 180, I know, but it soon will be 200 if the way things are, with inflation, it'll soon be 200. Why am I paying this money for something I don't use? That's the problem the BBC faces. And that is the upcoming problem which the BBC will face in 2027 when the government has to decide on the renewal of the charter. The BBC operates under this Royal Charter, and the big question, which is going to be now the hot potato for the next Director General, is going to be how do we fund ourselves going forward? And there are various possibilities. I think what is quite plausible is this. I've seen this floated by people in the industry who I know, that there might be a hybrid license fee. So something quite modest, which would pay for core news services, whatever you define as the BBC's core services. So that money, that would pay for that. And then if you wanted the goodies, if you wanted the next line of duty, you have to pay extra for that on a subscription service. That would make a kind of sense. And actually, I have always believed, actually, that the BBC, if it had to compete in the market, because one thing, should be said about the BBC, its craft skills, its TV and radio craft skills in terms of production value and knowing how to do things properly, are, they are top class. They're the best, they're right up there with the best in the world at doing what they do in terms of, craft skills, the actual professionalism of the organization. So they could employ, and it actually with the impetus of having to earn their money in the market on their backs, I think the BBC could be a formidable competitor in the market. So I think that although the BBC would very much like to adopt the German market, the German model, which is this household tax which everyone has to pay to keep their Rundfunk going, but actually, I don't think that politically flies any longer. The Labour Party was always sympathetic to the BBC, but even the Labour Party in government now is going to find it difficult to hold the line on the licence fee, is my view.
Robin, thank you very much.